If you've got the NFL offseason blues now that the Super Bowl's over, thinking that your Sundays just aren't going to be the same until football starts back up in September, I've got just the thing for you. It's NASCAR DFS season, baby, and we're kicking it off with the best NASCAR weekend of the year in Daytona. NASCAR DFS is a ton of fun. It's an awesome sweat. It can be a pretty high edge sport because of how valuable simulations are. And it follows a pretty similar schedule as NFL. You've got the big race on Sunday each week, and then the smaller races on Friday and Saturday are similar to how the Monday Night Football, Thursday Night Football, Sunday main slate feels for NFL. My name is Jordan Chan. I'm SaberSim's head coach, and in this video, I'll walk through how to build winning NASCAR DFS lineups on SaberSim. If you're brand new to the sport, I'll show you a foundational process that you can build from that'll put high quality plus EV lineups in your contest right away. And if you're a seasoned vet, you can follow this foundation. You'll learn a few things and it'll help kick the dust off as you get ready for the 2025 season. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Now, the first thing I want to talk about before I even start building lineups is where I think some of the edges come from, especially when you're building with simulations. Average projections are really not indicative of overall upside for individual drivers. They, in particular, don't help you understand the extremely varied distributions of drivers of what is actually possible in any given race. Now, to build high quality NASCAR DFS lineups, we need to understand the upside outcomes for each drivers, how many points they are capable of scoring, and how often they get there. Average projections assume that drivers score their average 100% of the time. And even if you're using something like randomness on a traditional optimizer, you are just then assuming that that driver has a bell curve distribution around their average projection. And distributions in NASCAR are extremely diverse. They change a ton based on the driver's skill, where the driver is starting in that particular race, and the characteristics of that race overall. You'll see a huge variety here just clicking through these on SaberSim. You'll see drivers, especially in a race that is total chaos like Daytona, that have very flat distributions. You'll see drivers whose distributions are all at the very high upside outcome for races later in the season if they are starting at the top of the race and it is very hard to pass in that race. As a result of this, for people building with traditional optimizers, you'll often hear people say that NASCAR is a very rules heavy sport, that you have to set a lot of rules to get lineups that make sense. And this is a symptom of those average projections and things like randomness alone being a very poor guide to what makes good lineups. But those rules are just heuristics. They are rules of thumb, like take 3 of the guys starting at the top of the race for races later in the season and only play one of them, or for Daytona, making sure all of your lineups have guys that are in the back of the race. These rules could be directionally correct, but they miss a ton of nuance. And that is why simulations can be so valuable. When you're building on SaberSim, each lineup that you get out of our optimizer is the perfect lineup, the optimal lineup for a single lap by lap simulation of the way that the race could play out. We're running these simulations 100,000 times, incorporating Vegas odds, driver skill, track history, all of these different factors to come up with all of the different ways that the race could potentially play out. When you get each lineup back from SaberSim and each lineup is an optimal for a given single race simulation, those lineups naturally have the upside that it takes to win because they binked the simulation they were built from. Coupled with that, because this is a sport where you are picking 6 drivers to build a lineup out of a probably about a 35 driver field, and generally playing large field GPPs, this is a sport where duplication matters. While it's good to play lineups that have a relatively high probability of coming in first place, you also want to balance that with playing lineups that other people are less likely to play. If you win first place but share those profits with hundreds or even thousands of other players, you are losing some of the money that you should have earned from coming in first place. The expected value of your lineup goes down each time it's duplicated in your contest. But you need to balance that with how likely a lineup is to be the actual optimal lineup, which is a hard thing to do, and that's where contest sims come into play. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, but those are the 2 reasons why simulations can be so valuable and why I believe this to be a high edge sport. Average projections alone do a poor job of coming up with high upside lineups, and heuristics about ownership and cumulative ownership sum or product ownership do a poor job of accounting for duplication. So let's start the lineup building process. The first thing that we actually want to do is upload our entries file. I've already registered for contests here for Sunday's Daytona race. So I'll get my entries file loaded in the contest tab on SaberSim, and I want to touch briefly on contest selection and slate selection here. This is a very high variance sport. We're racing cars after all. So there are crashes, there are engine failures. It's not as if you are always going to get paid off for playing in a plus EV every single slate. And we can reduce that variance in two ways. The first is by playing more slates. So the big race every week is going to be on Sunday. That's the Cup race. But there is also a trucks race and an Xfinity race, normally on Friday and Saturday nights each week. If you're serious about realizing as much profit over the course of the season, I highly recommend playing all three slates each week. It's going to get you 3 times as many shots on goal over the course of the season. And while the prize pools are smaller for trucks and Xfinity, lowering that variance by playing more slates and by playing smaller contests for those races, you are going to put yourself in a situation where you have more opportunities to realize your profit. When selecting contests for each of these slates, you want to follow the DFS profit plan. If you haven't seen that before, it's our contest selection and bankroll management manifesto. I'll drop a link in the description of this video so you can watch that. But the general rule here is to focus on playing as many lineups under the $3 threshold as possible. That's the $3 entry fee threshold. Doing that is going to mean you're playing against the softest competition, since the players with very high lifetime winnings on DraftKings and FanDuel can't enter those contests at all. But it's also going to mean the money that you're committing to each slate is going towards as many lineups as possible. To avoid going broke, you want to play around 2.5 to 5% of your bankroll max per slate. So I have about, say, $240 here for Daytona on Sunday, but you can see that's getting me 240 unique lineups. If I just dumped all of these into the big main GPP here, I would get a little less than 20 lineups here. By playing 240, I have way more shots at goal at figuring out how to get a lineup into that first place spot. Over the course of the season, this compounds a ton. Not only am I less exposed to the risk of having a particularly bad slate because I'm managing my bankroll well, but I'm giving myself an opportunity to realize my profit more quickly. By the law of large numbers, the more lineups I play, the closer my actual ROI is going to get to my expected ROI. And if I have one of those wins, then I can reapply that bankroll next week more quickly. So to limit some of the extreme variance we have in this sport, play all three slates when possible and focus on getting as many entries as possible as you can with the amount of bankroll you're willing to commit. If you want to throw a couple lineups into the main GBP as more of a gamble lottery ticket type thing, that's totally fine, but you should be focusing on the profit plan for the main core of your contests. So let's actually now build some lineups here. And I typically don't make any changes to my overall portfolio when it comes to building my lineups. I want to make sure that I'm just seeing what the sim's like for my very first build. We'll have an opportunity to make some adjustments towards the end here, but for the first build, I just want to go with what the sims are giving me. So all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to make 2 changes to the DraftKings projections here, or 2 changes to the projections to abide by the DraftKings rules. And then I'm going to build some lineups. And again, what SaberSim is doing here is it is sampling our pool of hundreds of thousands of different simulations of this race to come up with 5,000 optimal lineups, each of which is the perfect lineup that could have been built for a given way the race may play out. These lineups are naturally going to have the upside it takes to win GPPs because they won the simulation they were built from. We don't have to worry about setting rules or groups or anything like that to get lineups with upside. They're naturally going to have that upside already baked into them. So now that our lineups are built, we're ready for the next step, which is sorting our lineups to find which ones are the most profitable here. By default, your lineups are going to be sorted by SaberScore, which is a heuristic back-tested based on our contest sims that identifies the best possible lineups by looking at how often the lineup is optimal, its average projection, and its ownership here. This is going to be directionally accurate. This is going to do a good job of identifying good lineups from your pool. But if you want to identify the best lineups from your pool, I highly recommend it using SaberSim Ultimate and our contest sims. I'm going to kick off my contest sims here, but what this is doing, it's taking each lineup out of our pool of 5,000 and simulating its performance in a version of each contest I'm playing. I'm entered into 11 contests for Sunday. So we're seeing how we expect each lineup in the pool to perform in those contests using the size of the contest, the payout structure of the contest, and what we expect your opponents to do in each of those contests in terms of what lineups they're playing. This is where you're really taking into account how likely lineups are to be duplicated or how likely other players in your contest are to play the same lineups, which is the other factor of where a lot of the edge in this sport comes from. We want to play lineups that have a high probability or a relatively high probability of coming in first place or having a top finish, but we also want to play lineups that other people are unlikely to play. The more unique our lineups are, the less duplicated they are by other players in the field, the more of those top prizes we get to take home when we get those big first place or top 0.1% finishes. Okay, so now that our contest sims are complete, you can see our ROI numbers start to populate over here and also on the lineup cards for each individual lineup. And our lineups are being sorted by the contest sim ROI. At this point in the process, I typically like to get my lineups filled so I get a better sense of what I'm playing on that slate. So to do that, I'll go over to the autofill here and we'll expand this a little bit. And then I like to sort by prize pool and use the unique rank fill method. What this does when I click save to contest is it's going to fill each contest in order, putting the best possible lineups for each contest based on that contest's sim ROI, while making sure I'm also using a unique lineup in each entry. So for my portfolio of contests I'm playing, the best 20 lineups for the slingshot are getting filled into that contest, and then they're eliminated from the pool. They're not being used anywhere else. Then the best 20 lineups of the remaining lineups that are available are being filled into the happy hour. This is the $1.20 max. That is for this lineups contest, this contest sim. Then we get down to this single entry. We're going to find the best lineup remaining in our pool based on that contest sim. And this is really valuable because each of these contest sims are going to grade out a little bit differently. The lineups that are very good for a smaller field single entry are different than a very large field contest like the Minimax. So you're accounting for the payout structure and the size of these contests as you're doing this fill. So now that our entries are filled, that's basically the foundational process here. You should still do some work here to fine tune and review your exposures here, make your build your own a little. I'll show you how to do that in just a sec. But if you just did this over the course of the season here, you'd probably be playing profitable lineups each slate you play and grade out pretty well in our post-contest sims in Contest Flashback. But this is the part of the process where you should take some time to review your portfolio and make sure you're happy with what you're playing here. The best ways to do that are with these three columns, the exposure, pool, and leverage column, primarily this leverage column here. The leverage is calculated by taking your exposure, the percentage of lineups that contain a particular driver, minus the ownership projection. It's going to show you who your highest over and under the field on relative to that field ownership here. So your highest positive leverage drivers are the drivers that you're taking the biggest stands on. Your lowest negative leverage drivers are the drivers that you are fading the most. And this is where you can apply your research. If you have takes on particular drivers or teams or manufacturers, or just a gut feeling on a couple of these guys, you can tweak your min and max exposures here to adjust your leverage. And I typically use the highest and lowest leverages I see out of the build as a bit of a guidepost. So SaberSim says that its favorite driver right now at the time I'm building this is Daniel Suarez, and we're about 12% over the field on that particular driver. So let's say your research takes you in the direction of maybe being really high on a guy like Kyle Larson. We're currently over the field by 3.1% on Kyle Larson. If we wanted him to be our top play on the slate, we could get, say, about 10% over the field on him by setting a min exposure to around 35% and then refilling our contests. Now, SaberSim is going to go through the same process of identifying the most profitable lineups with this approach here. And you can see now Kyle Larson is our biggest stand. And in terms of magnitude of that stand, it's about as big as we were on Daniel Suarez before. I think leverage is really useful when you think about it in this way here is one, getting a sense of what your overall portfolio looks like, but also getting a sense of how big of stands you should be taking relative to the field. Pool column can be really useful to get a sense of how many lineups in your overall 5,000 or 500 lineup pool have a particular driver in it. And where this is particularly useful is if you want to take bigger stands in one direction or the other. So let's say you really like Denny Hamlin for this particular race. Well, we only have 256 lineups out of the entire pool that have Hamlin in it. That's only 5% of our pool. If we wanted to take a relatively large stand on Denny Hamlin, maybe we want to get up to like 20% exposure, we can set a minimum exposure to 20% and refill our lineups, and SaberSim should be able to accommodate that. But what we're really saying when we make that type of adjustment here is that we think he's underprojected, that he's going to have a good race in a lot more of the simulations than the projections would indicate. And we want to find the best possible Denny Hamlin lineups to play in that case. But we only have 5%. We're only looking at 256 of them here. If you are making changes to drivers where you want to take a big stand where you either want a big fade on a guy that is taking up a ton of your pool, or you want to take a bigger stand on a driver that is showing up in very little of your pool, you may be better served making 10 to 15 to 20% adjustment to their projection here. If I then instead bumped Denny Hamlin up to about 25 points and then rebuilt my portfolio here and then reran my contest sim, I'm going to have more Denny Hamlin lineups to work with here, making it easier to find the highest ROI ones from that pool. In practice, either of these approaches are fine, and I like to mix and match them. You can use min and max exposures for more subtle adjustments here and make projection adjustments when you want to get a lot more or a lot less of a driver in your overall pool. Now that this build is complete here, we can see that now we're up to 15% Denny Hamlin in our overall pool. We have about 3 times as many lineups to look at here. So when we run that contest sim, it's going to be more likely that we're getting better overall high quality lineups for Denny Hamlin out of our pool when we do our fill. Now, as for your actual research process or your review process here, I am no NASCAR expert here. So I typically take the approach of coming at it from more of a game theory angle. I am looking for reasons why I might want to get a little bit over the field on lower owned drivers and get under the field on higher owned drivers. It doesn't mean I'm blindly fading all of the chalk and slamming only low owned plays. But in a high variance sport like NASCAR, I let the ownership generally guide a lot of my stands I end up taking. One of the biggest things that I like to do here is think about driver skill as it relates to the ownership projection. Projections on the whole are very heavily driven by the start position and the characteristics of that race. So for a race like Daytona, you're going to see that drivers starting in the back here are very likely to be the highest projected drivers in the field. That's because this is a very chaotic race and drivers are likely to make up a lot of place differential points purely by starting in the back. In a race where it's very hard to project exactly what's going to happen, if you start at 40th, like Jimmy Johnson here, start finishing any higher than literally in last place is going to be positive points. If you are starting at the front of the race here, it is very hard to make up those place differential points. Chase Briscoe, who is starting in first, can only move backwards here unless he finishes in first place. There are other races later in the season where you'll see the opposite. It's very hard to make up spots. The race is comparatively low variance here, so drivers that start in the front have a very big competitive advantage. But this is the way that the average projections work out. If any of these drivers finish in first place, you are still going to need them to actually take down a tournament. And drivers that have more skill, higher quality drivers overall, are more likely to be able to deal with the disadvantages that their start position for that particular race may create. So, to sum up basically what I'm saying here is I often like to look for low owned, highly skilled drivers that are low owned because their average projection is low, or on the other hand, I like to fade poor drivers, lower skilled drivers that are highly projected because of the advantages that their start position gives them. And if you don't have any sense of overall driver skill, like I did a couple years ago here, you can use salary as a little bit of a guidepost. The salaries are set most of the time before the starting grid comes out. So they are in some ways in a vacuum view of how the drivers might be ranked here if every driver was starting from the exact same position in the race. DraftKings, for example, believes that Denny Hamlin is the most skilled driver in this field. It's typically set with the very opening odds at Vegas. Now, his average projection is a lot lower, and you are going to get him at a huge ownership discount because he is starting at eighth. That is a disadvantage. That is a disadvantageous starting position for a race like Daytona. But he is a very skilled driver. He is more likely to be capable of potentially putting up a big score, winning this race here, than a lesser skilled driver starting in eighth place. Now, on the flip side, other types of drivers here might be guys like Justin Haley, Jimmy Johnson, Noah Gragson here. These are lower salary drivers here that presumably have a lower overall skill level that are very highly projected and expected to be very chalky because of the advantages that their start position gives them. They are drivers that I'm more likely to fade. Now, you don't have to copy this overall strategy word for word. This is not necessarily a blueprint that you have to follow here, but in my research process, that is generally who I look for to target my research here. I am looking for reasons why I might want to fade some of these drivers or reasons why I might want to take a stand on some of these other drivers. And as you saw here from the initial leverage column that we got out of that first build, you don't typically need to take huge stands to get a little bit of an edge on the field for some of these guys. A lot of times, my biggest stands on the field for my highest positive leverage is probably going to come in around 10 to 15% over the field. My biggest fades are going to be probably anywhere from 5 to 10% under the field. But I'll review my portfolio each week, take a look at how the projections and the start positions and ownership break out, and look for a few opportunities to get low owned, highly skilled drivers in my pool and fade lower skilled, low salary, highly owned drivers. At the very least, you're leaning into the variance and leaning into the game theory elements there. You are putting yourself in a position for the drivers that you're taking bigger stands on to get paid off for very low owned plays, having high scores. And on the flip side, you're going to lap a ton of lineups if one of these drivers that is extremely chalky ends up having a poor performance or just crashing or having an engine failure or something like that. But once you're happy with your overall portfolio, it's time for just one more fill here, and then you're ready to upload your contest to the site. We can do that here with the download icon in the upper left and get this uploaded into DraftKings. Now, the SaberSim team is extremely excited for the start of the 2025 NASCAR season, and we made some updates under the hood in the back end to the underlying NASCAR simulations. These updates do a much better job of creating accurate projections and accurate distributions for each driver for each race over the course of the year. And I spoke to Eric on a stream today here breaking down these changes. You can watch that stream if you want more NASCAR content here. In the meantime, thanks for watching and good luck this season.